here's an example. We're going to walk through this typical problem. You've got an exception. Something is going wrong in your application, but it's only happening in test automation. It's only happening under high load, and it doesn't happen when you attach the debugger. I don't know how many times I've experienced this in my career. You attach the debugger, the problem doesn't happen, or if you don't have access to that environment in which the problem occurred, well, you're pretty much out of luck. Now, what happens when it's 2 o'clock in the morning and you just have no idea where the problem is? Well, we're going to show you some techniques next to really help with that scenario of when I have a rogue exception. So I've got my application started up once again. So let's have a look at what happens if I log into this guy, and I'm going to walk through and have a look at a particular issue. So let's go ahead and see if we can delete some of these guys. So it's going to say, yeah, do you really want to delete them? You're really going to mess things up. You're going to remove all the actions, iterations. I really do want to delete them. And you know, in this case, that turns out to be not a good thing. In fact, a very bad thing. We can see we've got a big nasty exception being thrown on the screen. And while the steps I took to get here, you can imagine maybe this problem happened because there were multiple users connected, because the load was too high on the system, because there was bad data in the database. Very difficult to say. So here I've got this problem now, and let's walk through sort of a typical what happens when something like this gets reported. So if I go ahead and log out of here, luckily I have this problem recorded, so I don't even need to worry. But let's go ahead and look at what we've captured up in the cloud. So this problem is now being recorded, and I'm going to actually shut down that server so that we'll let this guy complete. Now we have 5561 is the problem that we just recorded. Now that's in the process of being uploaded. In just a minute or so, that's going to appear. But we know already that some bad things happened during that particular recording. In fact, one of those things we know is we had a really nasty exception on the screen. So let's see if this guy is getting close to done. So we know that this problem in just a minute is going to appear here. And what I'm going to be able to do is actually dive down into that recording and see exactly what we captured. So let's start off by looking here in Eclipse, and I'll go back to my recordings. So all my recordings, 5561 is the one we just made that captured that problem. So I'll dive down into that, and we can see that we had one login from this IP address. And if I dive into that, we can see here are all the URLs that were accessed, and boom, we just had this 500 error. Now, one of the things I can do if I have thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of transactions is just say, you know what, just show me the failed transactions. In this case, it's an internal error coming from this particular URL. So I'll unclick that so we can see the context. I can sort on that as well. I can quickly see that this particular transaction resulted in an error, and here's the actual request that went in. It looks like it's a delete lead request, and if I go back and sort by time, we can see that what we did right before was look at all the leads and then the task list before we had this error. So we can see exactly that we have an HTTP 500 error. If I flip over to my log view and look at the logs for this particular issue, I can see that I actually don't have any logs at this point. There's nothing that's really telling me what happened here. There's nothing that was output to my log. But if I flip over to the markers and I look at that, I can actually see a bunch of Hibernate exceptions. So you recall, if you look closely at that stack trace, you would have actually seen that it was being thrown from Hibernate. So luckily, Replay has detected that. Our recording has detected that there was an exception being thrown. In this case, we can see it's a Hibernate exception. And once again, I can actually toggle some breakpoints on these exact events that occurred, which occurred during that offending transaction. So what we're going to do from here is actually replay right to that particular problem in the source code. And yeah, we'll just go ahead and save that. So now we're replaying the application. We're running every line of code in the exact same way as we did. I'm just going to close that because it'll run a lot faster, and we don't need that. So now I've actually gotten right back to the point in the source code where that exception was thrown. So here, once again, I have all my threads running. I have my call stack, and you can see down the call stack, here's the actual error that was thrown, trying to add to batch. We're deep in Hibernate code here, and if we go up the stack, we can see there's my JDBC transaction, and it looks like here's my code, and I can actually see, if I make that larger, here's exactly where we are in the source code. We've broken. This is a live debug session. I can actually step through this code, and I can see that we're right in the midst of processing a delete request, and it looks like we're setting tree index to, or I should say we're setting the ID of the deleted the object scheduled for deletion is being set to this tree index integer. So something is wrong here. I want to understand that better, and I can very quickly walk through this code, step through it again, set a real breakpoint, and run that again. So let's actually do that. All right, so let me go ahead and stop this guy, and I'm going to tell it I want to replay.
And Jonathan, we've actually just had quite a few people join in the last 5 minutes. Obviously joined a little late. There will be a recording of this event available. We will send it to people. You're listening to Jonathan Lindo, Vice President of Technology and Product here at Replay.
Thank you, Grover. I feel like we're on a radio session here. All right, so what we're doing now is replaying once again to the problem, but this time I've actually set a breakpoint right before that exception was thrown. We can see we're right here once again inside the code that caused the error. Let me step through that. And as we see, we're in this code, so let me go ahead and actually open this guy up, and we'll have a look at the variables and see what's going on in memory. So get my variable window open here. So it looks like tree index is somehow set to this bogus value, 9440. And let me step through that a little bit more. We can actually see that that's not right. This should be actually setting it to the object that was passed into this method, which is the actual ID of the object scheduled for deletion. So very quickly, I was able to use that to get right back to the piece of code with no database, without any access to the load that was on the server when the problem happened. Once again, here's my stack. We can run up the stack and see exactly the caller that resulted in that error. And very easily, I can understand exactly where we were in the process here to get back to these exceptions. So let me also quickly jump back to our recording up in the cloud. We can see that that's now complete. And if I flip over to these markers, there are those Hibernate exceptions again. So if I'm a QA person, if I am a responsible for testing, or even another developer, and I want to communicate this to someone else, I can say, go and grab this ID. You'll see that it's going to bring you right back to the exception that I saw in the code, and you can understand what's happening. And you have a link right here to the exact transaction. Here's that transaction that was responsible for that exception, and here's a link to the recording. So all of that is right there available to you. And right from this web UI, you can click Replay to Marker, and it will run you back to that exact point in the code where the problem happened and really help you understand why an error occurred and see the root cause in just a few clicks of the mouse. All right. So Grover, maybe I'll pause there and see if there's any questions or anything that we have thus far coming from the audience.
Yeah, there are some questions. There are questions about what if I need to do something similar or almost identical, but I use NetBeans or another IDE? What happens then?
Yeah, so that's perfectly fine. You can use NetBeans. You can use IntelliJ. Those IDs are fully supported. We do have a plugin for Eclipse that makes it a little easier in Eclipse to track down some of these problems. But you certainly can use any IDE. In fact, if you want to use a command line debugger, that's perfectly fine as well.
Okay. Another question is what's the sweet spot? Is this primarily for developers? Is it primarily in the test or the staging or production? What are people really in the real world doing this?
I'd say the majority of the usage of this starts in development and test. So any kind of testing, any kind of automation, functional testing, manual testing, huge value, and certainly can be deployed in production. If your customer has a problem, you can grab a recording of the problem from them, bring it back to home base, and use that recording to see the root cause very easily as well. So
okay.
Those are the kinds of things.
Another question is, tell us about actually deploying it with the application. Are there any cases where anybody's deploying this out when they send the application out of the house? Yeah,
it can be deployed, turned on by default. To turn it on is simply a command line parameter. Let me show that really quickly. So if I'm running Tomcat, for example, and I want to run with replay, this is how I would typically run Tomcat, catalina.bat space run. That's the standard Tomcat startup script that you get when you download Tomcat. I would simply add record to that. And all that actually does is add a command line parameter to the JVM startup command line. So very easy to turn on. It's a -X agent. We provide this record utility that does it for you, so it makes it simple. But turning it on is very, very straightforward.
Okay, so if I do that, if I want to deploy to a field application, how much overhead should I account for in my server stack? Because obviously this isn't like running just the app. You're running the app plus replay. What's the overhead like?
Yeah, the overhead it depends a lot on the load on the server and the type of application and what it's doing. We're only recording the non-deterministic or random sources of input into the application. So very little data is actually ultimately being recorded. So the overhead typically will tend to be somewhere between a 1%. It can be as high as in the 20s percentile in terms of CPU overhead, but that really depends on the application itself.
Okay. I got an environment question. What about running this in OSGI?
Yeah, no problem. Fully supported. There's lots of different technology stacks. Anything that runs on top of the JVM is going to be fully supported.
Okay.
And that includes for non-graphical applications. I'm showing a web-based, application with a web interface via the browser. This is absolutely fine if you want to use, if you want to look at recording data processing, ETL applications, ESBs, things that don't have a UI, web services, perfectly applicable.
Sure, and it looks like you're running this. There's a question here. It looks like you're running this in a Windows environment, .bats and all that.
Mm-hmm.
What if I need to run it on Linux?
Yeah, it's fully supported in Linux, almost all variants, SUSE, Red Hat, Ubuntu, lots more, and then all Windows as well.
Okay. What if I don't have a browser output? What if it's, as it says here, I've got one guy that says, what if I have a server-side app? What if somebody else says, what if it's just a CPU app? The other one says, what if it's an SOA-based architecture?
Yeah.
All variants on the, okay, what if there's no front end at all?
Yeah. Well, the only thing that needs to happen is if either you have a log file. If you don't have a log file, that's fine because Replay will detect problems in the code such as exceptions. Those will automatically be flagged. There's lots of conditions, error conditions that will automatically be picked up by Replay regardless of whether there's a user interface output.